Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm making a tier list of the 8 Mythic Plus dungeons in Dragonflight Season 3. I've spent a lot of time doing Mythic Plus already this season, and I have a lot of thoughts on the dungeons we have available. Now, I've made this point before, but to me a tier list is really just like an excuse for a conversation and kind of a way to rank everything, and usually in WoW we do them preemptively. They're more like predictions. But anyways, that's exactly what I want this dungeon tier list to be. I just kind of want to talk about some thoughts on them. So here's my first thought. I like them. They're tuned to be pretty hard, which is usually how this kind of thing goes. I feel like every single season going into the patch, players will say, man, this season feels like it's going to be really overtuned, and then it is. And then Blizzard nerfs the dungeons over and over during the first month of the patch. And that sort of seems like what we have this season as well. I'm also feeling pretty good about my tier list on tank rankings, like doing a lot of these on my monk, which is quite a bit better geared than my paladin. They were pretty brutal. Then I switch over to the paladin and I mean, it's like I turned the difficulty down 10 key levels. But with all of that being said, I really do like the dungeons that we have this season. I think it might be my favorite season just on the dungeons alone. I think there are really only two that are serious problems in terms of tuning and design. Thankfully, I think one is really easily fixable, and it could wind up being a good dungeon if that happens. And as for the other, I think the timer just needs to be like 3 minutes longer, and then that pretty much fixes it too. So let's just get into those dungeons. All right, this is take 2 because my mic wasn't on before. That's fine. So what I want to do here is I want to start out with just ranking all of these dungeons, and I really want to start with the best and the worst 2 dungeons and kind of use them as the outer limits for everything else to fall in between. And the best dungeon this season by far is atal'dazar. Everything about it is great. For one, it's just not all that hard, and everybody likes an easy dungeon. It's fast, which is amazing. The mob types in it are pretty good. The bosses are like pretty good and reasonably fair. Like, this is one of the all-time great dungeons, and I've really been reminded of that going back in there. I think I would even put it above Freehold, which I didn't think any dungeon could go above Freehold, but I gotta say, having just done a bunch of Freehold in the last month, and then now going in and doing a bunch of atal'dazar this week, I'm really liking the atal'dazar a lot more. Maybe it's because it's new, but it's not new. I did it a billion times during BFA, and it's pretty great. So there we go, atal'dazar. It gets its own tier, even above S. It's the best. And unfortunately, one of my all-time favorite dungeons, Throne of the Tides, they've kind of done the same thing now several times this expansion, where they bring in this really ancient dungeon, and it's kind of a fan favorite, or at least one that people like have fond reminiscences of, and then they just absolutely overtune it to hell, to turbo hell. And that's where we're gonna put this. We're gonna put this in its own new category called turbo hell. And you know what? We're even gonna make it a black background with black text so you can't even read it. It's just like, this place is so unbelievably cursed. And I really do think it's fixable. I think the main issue with this dungeon, there's really like 3 of them. There are the packs of dogs that put a stacking bleed on people and fixate, and they just basically will eat anybody in your group up if you're doing it on any sort of a higher key level at all. They just immediately start eating everybody to death. That's not great. There are also so many casters in this dungeon, and so many packs that will just be all of the mobs are casters. And a lot of them are healers too. So you have them spam casting Frostbolt or Waterbolt or whatever, because you have to you have to sit on your interrupt to be able to kick the heal, or they will full heal the group back up. So that's all brutal. And then at the end of the dungeon, once you've made it through and you're kind of limping to the end and everything seems like it's going to be up, you know, maybe you'll get in just under the wire, you get this insane constant mob respawning gauntlet that just absolutely demolishes your group right at the end. Also, just coming at this from a tank perspective, the final boss, if you step out of melee range at all, he will just immediately orbital strike your face in half. He just spam casts just insane damage. I can't remember the name of it, but it doesn't matter. Insane damage spell that he just spam casts, and he fills up the room with poo on the ground that has to be cleaned up. So just a really difficult final boss. I think the other bosses in the dungeon are actually pretty good, though. I think this is kind of fixable. They just really need to turn that damage way down, and they need to do more to make the final gauntlet not so incredibly evil. And probably put a longer cooldown on the healer's heal, the Oracle's heal. I think that would fix it, and it would be nice if one of these ancient dungeons that they bring back would be like fun and a fan favorite instead of insanely overtuned for once. Okay, let's just go alphabetically. Black Rookhold, I had no expectations for Black Rookhold. I did it a bunch during Legion. I never really liked it all that much, but I have to say, going back in there, man, it's really familiar. Better than I remembered. The only thing that really kind of stands out, and maybe this hasn't changed, the rocks on these staircases are so incredibly tight. Especially the second staircase, they're so incredibly tight to each other. That is really quite challenging to get up without getting hit. Unless you're on a paladin or something and you can just like bop or divine shield and ride up. And that's sort of a cheat code. But without that, boy, it's a lot of effort to get up those stairs. But other than that, the bosses are good. The trash in this dungeon is pretty good. Even though it's an indoor dungeon that's fairly tight and has ceilings and all, it's not hard to see around in, which is great. And so I really think it's probably the second best dungeon of this season. Darkheart Thicket was one that I'm really familiar with from having done a bunch during Time Walking and, you know, a bunch during Legion. I really did like it a lot during Legion. Man, oh man, I forgot how much the trash at the start of that dungeon absolutely shreds anyone in your group. I think I recorded a segment, I'm not sure, but there was a point earlier today where I was doing this where I was just spam healing outside of combat, just spam healing Flash of Light and Word of Glory onto people in the group, trying to let them, like, make sure they wouldn't die while out of combat to the bleed from the cats. Just absurd. Other than that damage, though, it's a really good dungeon. The bosses are good, the pulls are pretty good, they really are just, like, overtuned at the start of the dungeon, and then everything else other than that's pretty great. So I think it's one of the better dungeons, but there is a need for a damage reduction there at some point. Now, there are the two Dawn of the Infinites dungeons. Galakron's Fall is the lower one, GF, you can remember that. And then Murazan's Rise, MR, Mr. So, Mr. Girlfriend. Mr. sucks. Mr.'s brutal. The timer on it is way too short. And Girlfriend is awesome. We love Girlfriend. It's a fantastic dungeon. I really like it a lot. The only real issue I have with it is that it has a huge amount of percentage, like just a huge amount of trash. There's not like a ton that you can skip without invises or shrouds, but if you clear basically everything in the dungeon up through the third boss, you can shroud all the way to the fourth boss and you are at 100%. And if you don't have shroud, I think you go up to like 127 or 130% doing all that trash between the third and fourth boss, which is pretty brutal. But that being said, the bosses are pretty good. I really do like all the pulls in this dungeon, other than the pulls right before the third boss. They're sort of, if they look like two pulls because they're two dragons that pulse AoE damage and then tons of little slimes all around them, but you can actually split them up into several pulls each. And if you try to pull all of those at once, if your healer's not prepared, you will just get shredded. As for Murazan's Rise, I think it's thematically okay. I like the concept of the dungeon, and I think Chromie's a fun fight. One little pro tip that we finally learned in figuring out how to do that fight, or I should say Morchi, is that you want to look for the Morchi that's not wearing a hat, which is a clue that you would get if you did all the quest lines that unlocked whatever this dungeon is called, Dawn of the Ancients? No, Dawn of the Infinite. But if you haven't done all of that, if you haven't done all of those like quest lines from 10.1.5, you're gonna have no idea that the real Morchi that you're looking for is the one that's not wearing a hat or a wig. And there's nothing in the dungeon journal to indicate that. Like, I looked on a bunch of different fan sites to find that. I just eventually found it in like a comment section. Look for the one that's not wearing a wig. The ping system works really well, though. I have to say that this fight is like perfectly made for the new ping system, so that's pretty good. And in general, I think it's a pretty decent dungeon that's just a little overtuned in terms of like damage, and the room with all the sand really sucks. Unless you're on a prop paladin, you can deal with all the casters. It's pretty brutal to have to like get mobs to come at you from range, but then also they're casters, so you're reliant on like a ranged interrupt. That's pretty irritating. And on the subject of paladin, Everbloom basically, it's difficulty and it's like quality as a dungeon is going to fluctuate massively depending on what tank you're bringing in there. If you have something, basically a paladin or a demon hunter, that can just demolish casters, shut them all down, it's a great dungeon, and it's really easy. It's like not an S tier dungeon, but it is legitimately like a good dungeon, A tier. If you're not on one of those two ideal meta tanks and you're just reliant on a regular group's amount of normal interrupts, it's pretty terrible. The dungeon is rotten with casters. Every single pull, pretty much in the entire dungeon, other than the, I guess, first, third, and fourth bosses, has casters in it. It's casters all the way down, and they just spam cast. They alternate between spamming one cast and then using some sort of like ultimate cast that you have to camp on, a heal or a stun. And that is just really like, it's fine as a formula, but to have 2 or 3 of those in most of the pulls makes it pretty brutal to deal with, unless you have like one of the 2 tanks who can completely carry that dungeon. And then again, then it becomes fine. And like, I think structurally it makes sense for the second boss to work like that as well, to reinforce the idea of like, there's these spammy casts that you don't really care about, and then you sit on the ultimate cast and you knock that out ASAP. It's a fine design philosophy, it just does too much damage. If they tune the damage down on those casts to compensate for the fact that they're getting through all the time, I think this would be fine. Instead, it just makes it so that 2 tanks turn the difficulty on this dungeon down by like 4 key levels. Not great. And finally, Waycrest Manor. I came in really not expecting Waycrest Manor to be good at all. I had no expectations for it. I mean, like, all the downsides are there, right? It's Sanguine Week for the first week. Tight hallways, low ceilings, impossible to see anything that's going on. There are a lot of mobs in the left side, the, I guess, west side, that are like sort of shield and sword type of guys that hit insanely hard. Everything about this dungeon, hate it. The crones hit really hard and you can't CC them. I was sure I would hate it. I love it. It's really great. I like the freedom to choose which direction you go through the dungeon. I do think going left first and going to the sisters first, and then clearing out the middle so that you can pull all of the trash that's in Rawl's room, not all in one single pull, but all of it out into the courtyard and kill it out there, is great. The problem with this dungeon really is just the tight corridors and the ceiling, really. If the ceiling wasn't there and you could look down, or even if it was transparent, if you could look down and see what was happening instead of your camera being like directly between your shoulder blades, I think this would be a great, like, perfect dungeon. Because of that, and frankly because of Rawl, which I don't think is a particularly good fight, I think it's maybe just a notch below Galakron and Blackrook Hold. But I do think it's pretty great. I also think that my feelings on this are probably being tainted a bit by the fact that it is Sanguine Week. You know, if it weren't Sanguine Week, I probably would put it like a notch higher, but just the fact that it's so susceptible to Sanguine is a little annoying. But there's so much freedom in how you plan out your route, what packs you want to do, what order you want to do them in, and I think that's all great. I think the only real weak fight in this dungeon is Rawl. You could say I can't remember his name, the giant construct in the courtyard where all he does is slam the tank and you run him into fire, but there is still like a meta game to that of when do you want to run him into fire compared to like how long can you hold out on tanking him. I think that's pretty interesting. And I think the 2 fights that are downstairs, Lord and Lady Waycrest, I think that's a great one. And then I think Gorak Tool is one of the best Mythic Plus fights they've ever made. The mechanic of like killing the ads and setting them on fire and crowd controlling them and making sure you interrupt the boss, like everything about it's just a really, really well-made fight. And yeah, I think it's a really good dungeon, just sort of hamstrung by the obvious design constraint of choosing to put a dungeon inside of a very tight, like, haunted house maze. What are you gonna do? This is what they wanted, and I think considering that constraint, it's basically as good as it could possibly be. So that's it. I think all the dungeons except for Throne of the Tides and maybe Murozond are pretty good. The only real problem with Murozond, I guess Everbloom too. Everbloom, casters do a little too much damage. Murozond, the timer's too tight. Throne of the Tides, it's a lot of problems. Basically, it boils down to too much damage, and the gauntlet is just insanely evil and needs to basically be turned off or turned way down. But other than that, I'm really digging this season and hope you are too. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.